The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh glow across the university cafeteria, where conversations merged into a steady hum of collegiate life. Steam rose from countless coffee cups, while the aroma of reheated pizza and instant noodles filled the air. Students clustered around circular tables, their backpacks creating small fortresses around their chosen territories. But in the far corner, where shadows seemed to gather despite the aggressive lighting, sat someone who didn't quite belong to the usual rhythm of campus social dynamics. Her name was Elena, and she moved through this world like a ghost with substance, present but untouchable, visible yet somehow separate from everything around her. 3 days. That's how long she'd been walking these halls, attending lectures where professors stumbled over her unfamiliar surname, sitting in libraries where other students whispered behind textbooks about the newcomer who never seemed to smile. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual energy, a symphony of clinking utensils, rustling paper bags, and the constant chatter of young voices discussing everything from weekend plans to upcoming exams. Elena navigated this chaos with practiced precision, her movements economical and purposeful. She selected a simple meal, a turkey sandwich, an apple, and black coffee, paying with exact change before finding an empty table near the window. She preferred corners, places where she could observe without being observed, though she was beginning to realize that anonymity wasn't as simple as she'd hoped. College campuses, she'd discovered, were ecosystems with their own predators and prey, their own unspoken hierarchies and territorial disputes. And newcomers, especially those who carried themselves differently, inevitably drew attention. The sandwich was unremarkable, the coffee bitter, but Eleanor ate with the same methodical focus she applied to everything else. Her jacket, a worn leather piece that had seen better days, hung loose around her shoulders, its sleeves long enough to cover what lay beneath. She'd learned early that some stories were better left unread, at least until the reader proved they could handle the truth. That's when the atmosphere shifted. The change was subtle at first, a dimming of conversations, a turning of heads, the kind of collective awareness that spreads through a crowd when something significant is about to happen. Elena didn't look up immediately. She'd felt this sensation before, in other places, other times. It was the electric charge that preceded confrontation, the way the air seemed to thicken when predators caught a scent. 3 figures moved through the cafeteria with the swagger of young men who'd never been told no, their presence commanding attention whether people wanted to give it or not. They wore their entitlement like expensive cologne, invisible but impossible to ignore. The leader was tall and lean, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His name was Bradley, and he moved through the university like he owned it, which, given his family's substantial donations to the school, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Flanking him were his constant companions. Devon, whose loud voice and crude humor served as entertainment for those who confused cruelty with comedy, and Trevor, whose imposing physical presence had settled more arguments than any words ever could. Together, they formed a triumvirate of casual malice, the kind of boys who peaked in high school but refused to acknowledge that their reign was supposed to end. They surveyed the cafeteria like generals planning a campaign, their eyes scanning for opportunities, for weakness, for fresh sport. And when Bradley's gaze landed on Elena, sitting alone in her corner booth, that predatory smile widened. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "it appears we have a situation that requires our immediate attention." Devon snickered, already anticipating the show. "New blood?" "Indeed," Bradley confirmed, straightening his expensive polo shirt. "And apparently no one's explained to her how things work around here." Trevor cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their section of the cafeteria. Other students pretended to focus on their meals, but Elena could feel their attention, like heat from a fire. They knew what was coming. They'd seen this performance before. The three boys approached with the confidence of apex predators, their footsteps synchronized in a way that suggested plenty of practice. Conversations at nearby tables dropped to whispers, then stopped altogether. Someone's phone buzzed. Another student quietly pulled out their device, sensing that something noteworthy was about to unfold. Elena continued eating her sandwich, though every sense was now hyper-aware. She catalogued their approach. Bradley in the center, establishing dominance through positioning. Devon to the left, closer to the wall to cut off potential escape routes. Trevor to the right, using his bulk to intimidate. It was textbook pack behavior, designed to overwhelm and corner their target. "Well, well," Bradley announced as they reached her table, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "What do we have here?" A new face in our little community. He slid into the booth across from her without invitation, his movement smooth and practiced. Devon remained standing, leaning against the wall with calculated casualness. Trevor positioned himself at the end of the table, his bulk blocking the aisle. Elena looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting Bradley's gaze, with a steadiness that made him pause for just a moment. There was something in her expression, not fear, not nervousness, but a kind of patient assessment that felt oddly unsettling. "This is usually where you introduce yourself," Devon chimed in, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. "It's called being social. Maybe they didn't teach you that wherever you crawled out from." A few students at nearby tables shifted in their seats. Someone whispered, "Should we get security?" But no one moved. No one ever moved. That was the unspoken rule. You watched, you whispered, you gossiped about it later, but you never interfered. Elena set down her sandwich with deliberate care, her movements controlled and purposeful. "Elena," she said simply, her voice quiet but clear. "Elena," Bradley repeated, testing the name like he was tasting wine. "That's exotic. Foreign, maybe. You're not from around here, are you? I can tell there's something different about you." He leaned forward, invading her personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "See, Elena, this campus has a certain social order, a hierarchy, you might say, and new people, especially mysterious new people who think they can just sit wherever they want. Well, they need to understand how things work." Trevor chuckled, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the table. "Yeah, there are rules. Unwritten rules, but important ones." Elena's gaze moved between them, cataloguing, assessing. She reached for her coffee cup, her sleeve sliding back slightly. The movement was innocent enough, but Bradley's eyes caught the glimpse of something dark beneath the fabric, a shadow that might have been ink, might have been more. "What's that?" he asked, his curiosity overriding his swagger for a moment. "You got some kind of art under there?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elena's hand paused halfway to her coffee, and for the first time since they'd approached, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You could call it that," she said. Devon pushed off from the wall, his interest piqued. "Come on, don't be shy. Show us what you're hiding. Bet it's some generic butterfly or inspirational quote, right? That's what girls usually get." The dismissive tone in his voice carried across the cafeteria, and more heads turned their way. Someone had definitely started recording now. Elena could see the telltale glow of phone screens pointed in their direction. This was becoming a show, which meant backing down wasn't really an option for any of them. Bradley reached across the table, his fingers moving toward her wrist. "Come on, Elena. We're just being friendly. No need to be antisocial." That's when she caught his hand. The movement was so quick, so precise, that for a moment nobody quite processed what had happened. 1 second, Bradley was reaching across the table with casual arrogance. The next, his wrist was trapped in Elena's grip, held with enough pressure to make his eyes widen, but not quite enough to cause real pain. Yet. "I wouldn't," she said quietly. The temperature in the cafeteria seemed to drop 10 degrees. Students at nearby tables leaned forward, sensing that the dynamic had suddenly shifted. Devon and Trevor both tensed, their casual postures straightening into something more alert, more dangerous. Bradley tried to pull back, but Elena's grip didn't budge. Her fingers were positioned with surgical precision, finding pressure points that most people didn't even know existed. "Let go," he said, his voice tight. "When you ask nicely," Elena replied. The standoff stretched for several seconds that felt like hours. Bradley's face cycled through emotions: surprise, anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been the first stirring of genuine fear. Around them, the cafeteria had gone completely silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of kitchen staff who hadn't yet noticed the drama unfolding in their dining room. Finally, Bradley forced a laugh. "Please," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. Elena released him immediately, her hand returning to her coffee cup as if nothing had happened. Bradley pulled back, rubbing his wrist and trying to reassert his dominance through sheer force of personality. "Feisty," he said, but his voice carried a new edge. "I like that. But you should know that grabbing people isn't very neighborly behavior, Elena, especially when they're just trying to be friendly." "Is that what you call it?" she asked, taking a sip of her coffee. Devon stepped closer, his earlier amusement replaced by something harder. "You know what? I think our new friend here needs a lesson in respect. Maybe she doesn't understand how things work at this school." Trevor moved to block the aisle more completely, his message clear. The trap was closing, and Elena was supposed to be afraid. Any reasonable person would be afraid. 3 athletic young men, clearly comfortable with intimidation, outnumbering her in a public space where no one had shown any inclination to intervene. But Elena wasn't acting like prey. She set down her coffee cup and leaned back in the booth, her posture relaxed but somehow more dangerous. "And how exactly do things work here?" she asked. Bradley's confidence was returning now that his initial shock had worn off. "Simple hierarchy. People like us, people whose families built this place, whose names are on buildings, who matter, we get respect. People like you learn to show it." "People like me," Elena repeated, as if testing the phrase. "Scholarships kids," Devon clarified with a sneer. "Charity cases. People who should be grateful they're even allowed to breathe the same air as their betters." And it was meant to be crushing, the kind of casual classism that had probably worked on countless other students. The reminder that they didn't belong, that they were only here by sufferance, that their place in this world was precarious and dependent on the goodwill of people like Bradley and his friends. Elena nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And what happens to people who don't show proper respect?" The question seemed to energize all 3 boys. This was familiar territory, the part of the conversation where their target usually broke down, where fear took over, and they could enjoy the sweet satisfaction of absolute dominance. "Well," Bradley said, leaning forward again, "that depends on how stubborn they are. Some people learn quickly, others." He shrugged. "Others find college becomes a very uncomfortable place. Professors hear things about academic dishonesty. Administrators get tips about honor code violations. Social media gets very unfriendly. You'd be amazed how quickly someone can become a pariah when the right people decide they don't belong." Trevor cracked his knuckles again. "And sometimes people need more immediate lessons. Sometimes they have accidents, trip down stairs, walk into doors, stuff like that." The threat was clear, delivered with the casual confidence of young men who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. Around them, students shifted uncomfortably, but still no one moved to intervene. This was the way things worked. The strong preyed on the weak, and everyone else looked away. Elena considered this information with the same calm attention she'd given everything else. Then she did something that no one expected. She laughed. It wasn't hysterical laughter or nervous giggling. It was genuine amusement, the kind of response someone might have to a particularly absurd joke. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, leaving everyone slightly off balance. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes. "It's just, you really have no idea, do you?" Bradley's face darkened. "No idea about what?" Elena pushed up her left sleeve. The silence that followed was absolute, not just quiet, the kind of total absence of sound that happens when an entire room collectively holds its breath. Because what they saw wasn't just a tattoo, it was a story written in ink and scar tissue, a narrative that spoke in a language most people never learned to read. The design started at her wrist and spiraled up her forearm in intricate detail. At first glance, it might have looked like decorative tribal work or an elaborate artistic piece. But the students closest to their table knew better. Some of them had older brothers in the military. Some had uncles who'd served overseas, and a few had enough experience with the world to recognize combat ink when they saw it. This wasn't art for art's sake. Every line, every symbol, every carefully placed element served a purpose. Unit markers, theater designations, achievement indicators. The kind of tattoo that wasn't chosen from a book or decided on during a drunken weekend. The kind that was earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of experiences that most people only saw in movies. Devon was the first to recover his voice. That's military ink. Special operations, someone whispered from a nearby table. Eleanor rolled up her right sleeve, revealing a matching pattern that told an even more complex story. 2 tours, she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Iraq first, then Afghanistan. Explosive ordnance disposal specialist, if you're curious about the technical details. The cafeteria erupted in whispers. Phones appeared from every direction now, everyone wanting to capture this moment, this complete reversal of everything they'd thought they understood about the situation. Bradley stared at the tattoos, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. She was supposed to be a victim, someone he could intimidate and control. She was supposed to be afraid. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor pulled out her wallet and placed a military ID on the table. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, honorably discharged 6 months ago. I started classes here last week under the GI Bill. The information hit the 3 boys like a physical blow. Everything they'd assumed, every calculation they'd made, every bit of confidence they'd built their approach on, all of it crumbled in an instant." Trevor, who'd been so quick to threaten physical violence, suddenly looked uncertain. Devon's crude humor dried up completely. And Bradley, who'd positioned himself as the alpha predator in this little ecosystem, found himself staring at someone who'd spent years in places where actual predators lived. "So," Elena continued, her voice still calm but carrying new undertones that made several students unconsciously lean away from their table. "Let me make sure I understand your proposal correctly. You're suggesting that you 3, children who've probably never faced anything more challenging than a difficult exam, are going to intimidate someone who spent 2 years defusing bombs in active war zones." She leaned forward slightly, and all 3 boys instinctively moved back. "That you're going to threaten violence against someone who's been trained by the United States military to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently." The shift in power dynamics was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like watching gravity reverse itself. Students throughout the cafeteria sat transfixed, their phones capturing every moment of what was clearly going to become campus legend. Bradley tried to salvage some dignity. "Look, we didn't know—" "No," Elena cut him off. "You didn't. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is that you saw someone you thought was vulnerable, someone you could hurt without consequences, and your first instinct was to attack. That says something about who you are as people." She stood slowly, her movements controlled and purposeful. Despite being shorter than all three boys, her presence somehow filled the space around their table. The question now is what we do about it. Devon found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. What do you mean? Elena smiled, and this time there was nothing pleasant about it. Well, you've made some promises about what happens to people who don't show you proper respect. You've threatened academic sabotage, social destruction, and physical violence. I'm curious to see how you plan to follow through. The challenge hung in the air like a sword. Around them, students whispered excitedly, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The campus bullies, the untouchable princes of privilege, were being called to account by someone who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be threatened, and definitely couldn't be dismissed. Trevor was the first to crack. It was just talk, you know? We weren't really going to... Weren't you? Elena asked. Because I get the impression this isn't your first time having this conversation. How many other students have you terrorized? How many people have you driven away from this school? The questions hit like accusations because they were accusations. Everyone in the cafeteria knew the answer. Everyone had heard the stories, seen the victims, watched as promising students transferred away or simply disappeared from campus life after running afoul of Bradley and his crew. Bradley tried one last time to reassert control. You can't prove anything. It's your word against ours, and people know us here. They know our families. True, Elena agreed. But here's the thing about military training. They don't just teach you how to fight. They teach you how to think strategically. And right now, I'm thinking about all those phones that have been recording our conversation. She gestured around the cafeteria, where dozens of students held up their devices, all pointed at their table. I'm thinking about social media and how quickly things spread these days. I'm thinking about how a video of three privileged boys threatening a female veteran might play in the court of public opinion. The color drained from Bradley's face as the implications hit him. His father's position on the university board of trustees, his family's carefully cultivated reputation, his own plans for law school, all of it could be destroyed by 30 seconds of viral video. But more than that, Elena continued, I'm thinking about how easy it would be to document a pattern of harassment, to gather statements from your previous victims, to present a comprehensive case to the administration about the toxic environment you've created here. She paused, letting that sink in. I'm thinking about Title IX violations, discrimination complaints, and the kind of federal investigations that universities really don't want to deal with. The silence stretched impossibly long. Students throughout the cafeteria held their breath, waiting to see how this would resolve. Some were probably disappointed that there wouldn't be physical confrontation, but most understood that what they were witnessing was actually more devastating than any fight could have been. Elena was systematically dismantling three young men who'd built their identities around the ability to intimidate others, and she was doing it with nothing more than words and the truth about who she really was. Finally, Bradley spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? I want you to leave, Elena said simply. I want you to go back to your dorm rooms and think very carefully about the choices you've made and the person you've decided to become. And I want you to stay away from me and anyone else you might consider an easy target. She sat back down and picked up her sandwich. Because if I hear about you bothering other students, if I get even the slightest indication that you're continuing your little reign of terror, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that everyone on this campus and beyond knows exactly what kind of people you really are. The threat was delivered in the same calm, conversational tone she'd used throughout the encounter, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than any amount of shouting or posturing could have been. Devon looked to Bradley, clearly hoping for some sign of what they should do next. Trevor shifted his weight from foot to foot, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, and Bradley himself sat frozen, understanding that he'd lost not just this confrontation, but potentially everything he'd built his identity around. "We should go," Devon finally whispered. Bradley nodded slowly, his movements mechanical. He started to stand, then paused, some final flicker of his old arrogance making him try one last time. "This isn't over." Elena looked up from her sandwich, her expression almost pitying. "Yes, it is. You just haven't realized it yet." And with that, the three boys walked away. Not the swaggering exit they'd planned, but a retreat so complete and absolute that students parted before them like they were carrying some contagious disease. The cafeteria remained silent until they disappeared through the doors, and then erupted in excited conversation as everyone tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Eleanor finished her sandwich in peace, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her for the rest of the meal. She'd dealt with worse than campus bullies, much worse, and tomorrow she had a chemistry exam to study for. As she gathered her things to leave, a young woman from a nearby table approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say thank you." Eleanor looked up, recognizing something familiar in the girl's expression, the hunted look of someone who'd been ground down by exactly the kind of treatment she'd just interrupted. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked. "Jessica. I'm a sophomore here. Those guys, they made my first year really difficult. I thought about transferring, but my family sacrificed so much for me to be here." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "They won't bother you again." "How can you be sure?" Eleanor smiled, and this time it was genuinely warm, because bullies are fundamentally cowards, and cowards don't pick fights they know they can't win. Jessica smiled back, the first real smile she'd managed in months. "Maybe we could study together sometime? I mean, if you want company." "I'd like that," Elena said, and meant it. As she walked out of the cafeteria, Elena reflected on how different this environment was from what she'd known before. The stakes were lower here, the consequences less immediately lethal, but the fundamental dynamics remained the same. There were always predators, always people who used power to hurt others, always systems that protected the strong at the expense of the weak. But there were also always people willing to stand up, to fight back, to say enough when everyone else stayed silent. And sometimes, when you'd been trained by the best military in the world and hardened by experiences that most people couldn't imagine, you could do more than just stand up. You could win. Behind her, the cafeteria buzzed with excited conversation as students shared videos and compared theories about what had just happened. By dinner time, the story would be all over campus. By morning, it would probably be online. And by the end of the week, Elena suspected, the social hierarchy that had seemed so fixed and immutable would be completely transformed. That was fine with her. She hadn't come here to make waves, but she hadn't spent 2 tours overseas defending freedom just to watch it trampled by privileged children who'd never learned that actions have consequences. College was supposed to be about education after all. And sometimes the most important lessons happened outside the classroom.